at least we can be certain about Galatians. And in Galatians, Paul has met Peter, James, and John in like Galatians 1:18 to 19 and 2 to 9. They directly were the disciples of Jesus. Like Peter was the leader of the church, and it's a very early source. This was it's around 50 A.D., around 20 years after Jesus' death. That's very, very early, straight after the fact.
Okay, so you're making
other sources.
So you're making a lot of assumptions here. So, you said he met James. He's referred to as James, the brother of Jesus, but according to some of the Gospels, if you add them all up, he has total of four brothers. So he claimed he did, right? So if you're writing fiction, you would put character. You would use real persons, places, and events and locations to augment your fiction.
You could.
And then you mention, well, like a Harry Potter book. And then you mention after the death of Jesus. So my point, so if I'm arguing, by the way, I consider myself there's a term I heard recently, only recently, a minimal mythicist. So, I can argue the point that Jesus never existed, but, I'm open to the idea that he did. But for example, the way I present it is, there was the Daniel 9:25 prophecy, right? The 70 weeks of 77, right? 490 years from this decree of Antherus. So basically, around year 0 or year 1, there was a Messiah craze, because a Messiah was prophesied. So all these guys are saying, you know what, that might be a good career move for me, right? If you're a carpenter or a fisherman in Galilee,
that's also an assumption. I mean, that you can make assumptions like that, but this is no different than what you said about me making my assumption.
Yes.
Except that I would say that first of all, this is true for all historical documents. I mean, you could disbelieve every single historical document there is about what they say. I mean, maybe if people just made up the story about the pharaoh, about Alexander the Great, and about Aristotle and Socrates, maybe they're just fictional characters. I mean, all of that is a possibility, but this is the data we have. This is first of all, so we have to work with that.
But I would argue,
second of all, it doesn't read like a fiction. Fiction is written in a very different way. This reads like an autobiography. Not an autobiography, a biography.
A biography.
Yeah.
So the distinction I would make regarding other historical characters, and I get this challenge all the time. People say, well, what about, Abraham Lincoln or George Washington or Socrates or Alexander the Great? And the only time I ever answer it was somebody say, well, what about Napoleon? And I'll say, well, we do have his penis in a jar.
Yes, I've heard you say that before. Yeah.
But the distinction I make with Jesus regarding Paul is, we know who wrote this. We know his motivations, right? He was
explain.
Well, what I would argue is that his goal during this time, he was to garner support for this insurrection against the Romans, right? Began in 46 AD, right? By these two brothers, Jacob and Simon, in Judea. And so the revolt was mainly in Galilee. And it began as a sporadic insurgency until about 48 AD, when Paul wrote, I guess Galatians was the first one. And then it was quickly put down by Roman authorities, and those two brothers were executed. So he created, my hypothesis is, this fiction of having witnessed this risen Messiah who did not appear, right? Because the first mention of Jesus is by Paul. And so he's creating this fiction of having witnessed this Messiah, right? And his brothers and everything else, because he wanted to show that the Messiah had come as was prophesied, but was murdered by the Romans. And so this was to entice the Gentiles to aid the Jews in their rebellion against the Romans.
Right. So my question to you is, why do you first say that we know this, and then you say it's my hypothesis? Because you said it first of all as if it was a fact, and now, uh, from what you said, it just sounds like a fiction you've created from history. There's, there is historical fiction that where we can alter history however we like. I can come up with any alternative explanation to any historical event as well. It's possible, but what reason do you have to justify that?
And we discussed this in our practice awesome debate slash discussion when we said, we can only each be certain of our own existence, right? And it gets really, really deep at this point. So, yes. So, what I use fact, it's not a fact, but the overwhelming consensus is that the Pauline epistles were written first, and around 48 AD was the first one. And then, but who is Paul writing to, right? He's writing to his own prayer houses. So Paul is writing to these prayer houses that were mostly in Turkey. And these were homes of wealthy people who adopted, became Christians and were hosting essentially church sermons. So that's who Paul's writing to. So the first documented mention of Jesus is by Paul in 48 AD. But again, he's writing to his own churches. Now, what do we know? No, that's pretty much accepted. Now, the rest of it. So we know that the Gospels were decades later. Now, and we also know that no one's witnessed Jesus. There's no record of it.
Right, but I still don't. I haven't heard what exactly is wrong with Paul's claim, or what. Why would you say that it is Paul's motivation specifically to make up this fiction? Where's the evidence for this motivation?
Well, Paul is can I call him a nut? He's a bit extreme, right? And he's the only, and none of the gospel authors even claim to have witnessed Jesus. Now, Paul claims that he witnessed Jesus. He met Jesus in a vision, and he described him as being only a bright light, right? And then he further claimed that all of his information about Jesus came to him from non-humans, which as a yeah, I'm reading So some of it, there's different interpretations of that, but
right,
one of them is not.
I mean, in order to make this interpretation, you have to first of all assume that like the miraculous is impossible from the very beginning. So,
Correct.
I mean, if you assume that, then there is no point of even looking into the Gospels. You can just say, I think that the miraculous is impossible, full stop, because after any further analysis is going to be done in light of that fact, right? So if you think it's impossible, then I suppose, yes, it is logical. I mean, it's a logical conclusion. This is the same conclusion I would come to if I thought that miracles were impossible. Then, of course, Paul must have hallucinated or something, because there is no other possible explanation, right? Or it's either fiction or he hallucinated. Is the only possible explanation if you automatically reject miracles and God from the get-go. But that plants a specific framework on the whole discussion. So, I mean, I can agree with you up to this point that if miracles cannot exist, and if God doesn't exist, then it had to happen that way. But I do not hold that assumption. So, I would say that you cannot really make that claim when arguing with Christians unless you also back up why you think miracles are impossible.
Yeah. So, for example, what is it in Matthew, where he claims that after the resurrection, which I believe is impossible. That,
Hmm.
by the way, I think in one of my recent sermons, I think it was in the last one, just was that yesterday? where where I showed all these. There's a whole bunch of resurrections right in the Bible. There's maybe a dozen of them. I think it was 2 weeks ago actually, and but it was in Matthew after the resurrection where he's claiming that that the corpses and skeletons rose out of the graves, and they walked into town and appeared to many. Now, I would consider, so if you got all these dead people, corpses and skeletons and whatever else you got going on, you got all these dead people walking into town, and you're out at the store buying bread. You got your daughter with you, and you're walking your dog, and you're looking out there, and I would think they would consider that to be an unusual event, and they would have
Yep.
documented it, and there's none, and it only appears in Matthew.
So the possibilities are either that it was some kind of an exaggeration or addition, like a colorful addition or something like this, or that the sources were lost and it was recorded somewhere. I personally hold no view on this. I remain agnostic about this specific line. So we have a single claim, and only from Paul, that 500 people rose from the dead. I can choose to believe that or not.
Or 500 people
It's
witnessed the risen Jesus.
Oh yeah,
That's
sorry.
more
Yeah,
than.
500 people witnessed the risen Jesus. But we have that is a claim coming from one man. It's not 500 claims, right? So it's a little bit different.
And whenever people tell me that, I always say, they say, more than 500 people witnessed Jesus. And I always respond, name one.
Well, we have a significant number of people who witnessed not Jesus. We have records of people not witnessing Jesus directly, but witnessing the people he was around, and I think that's good enough. I think it's good enough because there is no really there is it is possible like to doubt this, but it's possible to doubt anything. And if I met somebody and they told me that they know this guy and they followed him their whole life and they told me all about him, then I would assume that he exists. I wouldn't assume that he's
I
making
know,
it up.
but if my wife comes back from shopping and she says, oh, I saw a squirrel run across the street. Okay, that would be notable enough where she would tell me, but it would not be unexpected. That's an
Right.
entirely different situation rather than having all the graves open up and corpses walk into town and appear to many, and no one recorded it.
Okay, I'm not talking about that specific verse. I'm talking about like Jesus in general. Like we know that Paul met Peter. At least that he
We
claims he
don't
met
know.
Peter.
No, he doesn't.
That he met who else? James and John. That's three of the disciples, and it was written in such a way that it doesn't sound as if it was a fiction. It sounds as if he actually met them. Because fiction has a distinct character. It doesn't sound like if people wanted to make up fiction, it would look very different. And there are many reasons to assume this. Like right now, we value women just as much as we value men, but in the past that was not the case. And like the very fact that women went and saw the tomb, if I was to make up a fiction for that time, not for the like future of the 20th century, I would pick men as witnesses, not women, because to them that would seem a lot less credible. So unless they actually wanted to write down the truth, if they must have known how to write good fiction, or at least, I mean, anybody at that age would have known to add men as witnesses instead of women, because they would be more credible if they were writing fiction, which just makes it all the more credible in our age now that it is in fact not fiction. That it was, whether they were confused or not is a separate topic, but they recorded what they saw, and then it was passed on, and that's how it got to us.
Yeah, I just don't find that very persuasive. And of course, as we know, the first gospel, the women went there and they fled in terror. and that could be viewed as mocking the women. It's like, oh, what's with them? Don't they realize that Joseph took the body and buried it somewhere else? I'm just throwing that out there. I hadn't thought this through, but there's other
Mhm.
explanations, and I don't, in other
But
words,
but there are always other explanations. It's just that they are not very. I would say they are just not very credible. There is no reason to assume these other explanations. Like this is the simplest explanation. The simplest explanation is that they saw Jesus, and they came back to the apostles and told them about it. Like the
right, but we're
is
talking about like a resurrection of a body after decomposing for 3 days.
yes.
The most reasonable explanation is that there's a mistake. They went to the wrong tomb, or that this was all these.
Assuming Only assuming that miracles are impossible.
Yeah. So
So
we're
this is
just going to
so
disagree on that because I'm going to
yeah.
say,
I would say yes, that this is like the limit of how far we can take it, because the only other possible, and I think this is true for discussions with most atheists. Like for any atheists and Christians watching this, it is useful to come to the limit to see where we disagree about, in terms of our axioms of what we like, or the premises that we believe to be true, because the logic follows on from there. Like I don't think that your position is illogical per se. I think it logically follows, assuming your presuppositions, and
by the way, if I could just jump in here too,
yeah.